Okay, so we have some parts, and we've started interpreting those parts using some text evidence and some logic, like trees representing life in our experience, plus the text evidence of the monster using trees for shelter and food, and the references to destroyed trees to create an ominous tone. Okay, so here's where we can start to ask some interesting questions by connecting parts together. For this example, I have a new literary term for you: ambiguity. You probably have heard it used in non-literary settings, and it means more or less the same thing here, where there is some doubt or openness about meaning. Our everyday use makes this synonymous with being vague, but in literature, it's more about uncertainty, a device the author uses to make sure the reader cannot dismiss one or more meanings. For example, a case of linguistic ambiguity in John Keats's poem Ode on a Grecian Urn, in which he calls the urn a, quote, still unravished bride. That word still can mean the bride is still unravished, that it remains unravished, or it can mean still as in not moving. Here, in Frankenstein, the creature is ambiguous. Is he good? Is he evil? Really, ambiguity in character probably means the character is human. We're all a bit ambiguous even to ourselves. But in this instance, the ambiguity shocked readers and reviewers, a monster that was both good and bad, and neither good nor bad. They wanted an easy moral about Victor Frankenstein, but they do not get one. The ethical choices remain ambiguous even to the end. If I could convince the world of anything, it would be to embrace ambiguity. We're a little too quick to assign labels of good and evil, right and wrong, natural and unnatural to things, don't you think? Here, we can take this ambiguity and attach it to theme and ask, how does this ambiguity complicate the parent-child relationship? And why did Shelley want it complicated in that way? We can ask the same by connecting ambiguity to education as a theme. Likewise, we can connect all sorts of parts like setting to character. We can connect two characters and ask why they are alike or why they are contrasted. Good authors choose details for a reason. If you were to tell me about yourself, you would choose specific details for a desired result. If you told more or less the same story to your mother, wouldn't you change the details, the tone, etc.? Things exist in relationship to other things. That's why it's useful to think about connecting parts of the story this way, so that we can show a relationship. Even if things seem unconnected, or maybe especially when things seem unconnected, we can have surprising results that lead to a fresh understanding. You've probably heard this example before, looking at what kind of cause and effect relationship global warming might have to the war in Syria and the refugee crisis. This, of course, doesn't mean there aren't other causes to the problem, just like any reading of Frankenstein doesn't necessarily prevent other readings. In fact, our readings should inspire new connections and new relationships. Could the Syrian war have been averted had we recognized the environmental problems alongside the influence of agitating forces? Could we have stepped in with aid decades ago and prevented all of this instead of waiting for it to become a military problem? Let's start with another idea and take it from brainstorming all the way to an outline of an essay. I have two themes I've combined into one, based solely on the fact that this is what interests me academically. I study gender readings a lot, and I'm interested in how our education shapes us to discriminate against others. I believe the purpose of life is to secure the greatest possibility for happiness for ourselves and for others. I took that simple idea from Aristotle when I was still quite young. So, I have this interest, and because all three male narrators mention their education, Walton to his sister, Victor to Walton, the creature to Victor, I'm interested in how Mary Shelley dramatizes this tension. The other simple thing that leads me to this, pretty simple too, a woman wrote this book. But not a single woman speaks for herself. Women speak, but not frequently, and usually not in direct dialogue. But even when it is dialogue, it's still a man's memory and a man's version of that dialogue. A woman wrote a story about men, told by men, about the ambitions of men. And women play only a very small, seemingly incidental role. Why? There are other places where gender becomes important, like Victor's comparisons of his education with Elizabeth's, or with the creature's story of Sapphy. It is an education moment as well, if you recall, with Sapphy learning to read and the monster learning alongside her. If they have the same education, is the monster essentially feminine? We can also ask why it's at the moment of seeing a female creature that Victor refuses all ambiguity and decides his creature is absolutely evil. And that's not a bad start. I don't have any ideas yet, really, but at least I've got some parts written down. And I can start to ask questions, and if I don't quite know where to start, I could always turn to a little background research. There were educational philosophies at the time. New ones, Rousseau, for example, believed that education had the power to grant liberty. Ignorance allowed emotional and intellectual slavery. I also know that Mary Wollstonecraft, Mary Shelley's mother, wrote a lot about education. So I went digging to find some things that would help indexes and word searches through electronic text should help us find keywords like education. We frequently credit Percy Shelley with our modern preoccupation with originality and inspiration. Most people don't realize that he was greatly influenced by his relationship to Mary Shelley and his readings of his wife's mother, Mary Wollstonecraft. I was able to look in a biography of Mary Wollstonecraft and Mary Shelley and find references to Wollstonecraft's views of education, and she believed people needed an education that promotes domestic ties, family, and community relationships rather than personal ambition or wealth. That really helps me out, right? As background, the men are very much about their ambition in Frankenstein, and domestic ties are refused, and the outcome is not good. The only domestic relationship maintained is between the de Lacys and Sapphy. So, now I know that my question is going to be how men are educated and how women are educated, but also what would have been preferable to either. Maybe I'm still a little vague in my head, or maybe I know exactly what I want to do, but either way, secondary research will help. So I take my keywords like gender and Frankenstein and start performing searches. These articles might give me someone to agree with and expand on. They might give me people with whom to disagree. Either way, that will help me be very clear and specific about what I want to add to the discussion. And finally, I can start to collect all of my data. Here, I have an outline. I still don't quite know what my thesis will be, but I know what the topic is. I want to stress that you can save the thesis for last. Really, my thesis will likely be something uncomplicated for a 5 or 6 page essay, like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein demonstrates the failure of education for men, exposing that education as a source of intrinsic violence against women. I need next to set up my background section where my audience needs to know my starting place. They won't be able to agree or disagree with me if they don't know how men and women were educated at the time, so I probably need to find sources for that. I know I'll also be using Wollstonecraft's insistence upon domestic ties. As you can see then, even a really simple outline with not much on it can help me figure out what kinds of research I'll need and what kinds of arguments I'll need to make.